Your Honor, she's just a worthless old woman who never held a real job a day in her life. I built everything! Gerald's voice cracked the courtroom like a dropped plate. 46 years of marriage collapsed into that one sentence. I did not flinch. I turned to the bench, folded my hands, and smiled at the judge. Morgan, remember me? He froze mid-motion, gavel suspended in the air. Then he rose so fast his chair scraped the floor. Oh my God, he said. Is that really her? Beside Gerald, his lawyer went the color of old paper. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, though for the first 22 years of my life, I was Eleanor Doyle. And before this story ends, you will understand why that distinction matters more than anything Gerald ever put his name on. I am 68 years old. I have lived in the same small brick house on Larkspur Lane in Millbrook, Ohio for 39 of those years, raised 2 children at its kitchen table, and spent 40 of them keeping the books for a hardware store that my husband liked to call my business, as though the word my had ever once, in 4 decades, included me. I never drew a salary from that store. Not one paycheck, not one W-2, not $1 with my name printed on it. What I drew instead was a ledger. Every invoice, every tax filing, every late-night reconciliation when the register came up short. Because somebody had to keep Whitfield Hardware and Supply from drowning, and for 40 years, that somebody was me. I gave up something else too, though I didn't understand its full weight until I was 68 years old standing in a courtroom being called worthless. In 1976, at 18, I took a job as a legal secretary at a firm called Bennett & Cross, typing motions and filing briefs. And by the time I was 20, I was good enough at it that the partners let me sit in on strategy meetings just to take notes, which was more than most young women in that office were offered. I loved the law the way some people love music. Not because I understood every note, but because I understood the architecture of it, the way a well-built argument could hold weight, the way a well-built house could. I had 4 years there. I had, Harold Bennett once told me, the sharpest eye in the building. And then, in 1980, I married Gerald Whitfield, and Gerald said a wife of his didn't need to work, and I believed. The way you believe things at 22 when you're in love, and the world still looks generous, that I was trading one kind of building for another. For a long time, I thought I had made a fair trade. I want to be honest about that. Because this is not a story about a woman who was miserable for 46 years. It is a story about a woman who was patient for 46 years, which is a very different thing. And it took me a long while to understand the difference myself. The pattern started small, the way these things always do. It was never one moment. It was 100 small ones stacked so gradually I mistook the slope for level ground. It began, I think, in the spring of 2023, though I didn't have language for it yet. Gerald started closing his office door at the second store, the one on Route 9, when he took calls. He had never closed that door in 38 years of ownership. He started saying he had supplier dinners on Thursday nights, and then he started having them on Tuesdays too, and then some weeks there was no night left over for me at all. He bought a new cologne, something sharper and younger than the drugstore aftershave he'd worn since Reagan was president, and when I asked him about it, almost as a joke, he said, "Can a man want to smell decent, Eleanor?" I let it go. That's the thing nobody tells you about a 46-year marriage. You develop a talent for letting things go, and that talent, over time, becomes indistinguishable from blindness. Then came the filing cabinet. Gerald had always kept the store's financial records in an old gray 4-drawer cabinet in the back office, unlocked, because for 40 years there had been nothing in it I hadn't put there myself. In June of last year, I noticed a padlock on the bottom drawer. When I asked him about it, he said it was just some personnel stuff, nothing you need. I had done every hire and fire paperwork packet for that store since 1985. There was no personnel stuff that wasn't mine to see. Small things. A new laptop he wouldn't let me touch. A second phone I found once, briefly, in his truck's glove box, before he started keeping the truck locked too. A woman's name, Denise. That came up more and more casually, as though he were testing how it sounded out loud in front of me. Denise Prater, 34 years old, hired in 2019 as a regional sales rep for the Route 9 location. I had approved her hiring paperwork myself. I remembered thinking she seemed sharp, ambitious, a little too good for the job. I had no idea, back then, how right I was about the ambitious part. The thing that finally moved me from noticing to acting happened on a Tuesday in September, 7 months ago now, when my neighbor Peggy Sanchez knocked on my door at 9 at night, still in her gardening clogs, her face tight with something I hadn't seen on her before. Peggy had taught 4th grade for 31 years, 2 streets over before she retired, and there wasn't much that got past her. "Eleanor," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not shoot the messenger." Denise Prater's car, a red Jeep with a University of Dayton parking sticker, had been parked outside the Route 9 store until nearly midnight 3 times that month. Peggy walked her dog past there every night at 11:30. She'd seen Gerald's truck there too, every time. I didn't cry. I want that on the record, because I think people expect a woman my age to cry in a moment like that, and I didn't. What I did was thank Peggy for her kindness, close the door gently, and sit down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, not how could he, but how long has this been building, and what has he already taken while I wasn't watching? That was the decision, not the affair itself, though God knows that hurt in a way I won't dress up with pretty language. Lies. All lies, dressed as supplier dinners. The decision was this. If Gerald Whitfield had been quietly rearranging our life for 3 years without telling me, then I would spend however long it took quietly finding out exactly what he'd rearranged, and I would not tip my hand until I knew everything. I had spent 40 years building a business I had no legal claim to. I was not going to spend whatever years I had left finding that out the hard way, in a courtroom, blindsided. When had I become a woman who let a man make every decision that mattered? I asked myself that at my own kitchen table, at 67 years old, and I did not like the honest answer. So I decided to stop. I called Rachel Ostrowski 2 days later. Peggy had given me her name. Rachel had handled Peggy's sister's divorce 11 years back, and Peggy said the word shark the way other people say surgeon, meaning it as the highest compliment a profession like that can earn. Rachel's office was above a dry cleaner on Belmont Street. Small, no receptionist, a coffee maker that looked older than her law degree. She was maybe 45, sharp-jawed, hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, and she had a stack of case files on her desk instead of family photos. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. In 46 years, did you ever draw a paycheck from that store?" "No," I said, "not once. Did you ever have your name on the deed, the business license, any of it?" "No. Gerald always said it was cleaner that way, simpler for taxes." Rachel wrote something down, and when she looked up, her expression had shifted into something I would come to recognize as her courtroom face. Flat, focused, already 3 moves ahead. "Here's what I need you to understand," she said. "Ohio is an equitable distribution state. That business, whatever it's worth, whatever name is on the paperwork, is very likely marital property if it was built during your marriage. But likely isn't good enough when a man's had 3 years to hide the ball. We're going to need proof of your contributions. Every dollar, every hour, everything you can put your hands on. And we're going to need to know what he's already moved before he moves the rest." She looked at me directly then, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "Mrs. Whitfield, I have to be honest with you. Men like your husband count on their wives being too tired, too embarrassed, or too broke to fight back properly. Are you going to be tired?" "No," I said. "Are you going to be embarrassed?" I thought about that one for a moment. "Not anymore," I said, and I meant it. Rachel smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her. "Good. Then we're going to need a forensic accountant, and I know exactly who." That was the trusted ally who grounded everything that came after. Not because Rachel fought my battle for me, but because she was the first person in 3 years who looked at what I told her and believed, immediately and completely, that I was neither confused nor exaggerating. There is a particular kind of relief in being believed by someone whose job is to be skeptical. The plan Rachel and I built had 3 stages, and she was firm that we execute them in order. No shortcuts, because Gerald's lawyer. A man named Bradley Kessler, whom Rachel had crossed paths with twice before and described as expensive and lazy, which is a dangerous combination, would look for any procedural crack to argue I'd acted in bad faith. Stage 1 was documentation. For 6 weeks, quietly, before I ever mentioned the word divorce to Gerald, I went through 4 decades of records I had kept in a fireproof lockbox in our basement. Not because I'd been planning this for 40 years, but because I was a bookkeeper, and bookkeepers keep things. Every tax filing since 1985, every canceled check with my signature authorizing supplier payments, the 1992 loan documents for the Route 9 expansion, a small business administration loan for $180,000 that I had personally co-signed, my name right there on line 14, the same name Gerald's lawyer would later claim had never appeared on a single business document. And one folder I hadn't opened in 25 years. The paperwork from 2001, the year my father died, and left me $45,000, every cent of which I had wired directly into the business account that April to keep Whitfield Hardware from defaulting on a supplier note during a recession that nearly buried us. Gerald had cried that week, actually cried, and told me he'd never forget what I'd done. I kept the wire transfer receipt anyway. I have found, over the years, that it is wise to keep the receipt even for the things you're certain you'll never need to prove. Stage 2 was Walter Kim. Rachel brought him in as our forensic accountant, a quiet, precise man in his 50s who wore reading glasses on a cord and spoke slowly, like every word cost him something he wanted to spend carefully. Walter spent 3 weeks pulling public filings, bank records subpoenaed once Rachel filed the initial petition, and business registrations with the Ohio Secretary of State. What he found confirmed the shape of what Peggy's late-night sightings had only hinted at. In April of last year, Gerald had transferred 40% of the inventory value and the Route 9 property's equipment lease into a newly formed LLC called Whitfield Bros. Holdings, registered not to Gerald, but to his younger brother Frank, who had never worked a single day at either store. Walter's report put the value of that transfer at just over $410,000. Gerald hadn't sold anything. He had simply moved it out of reach, one signature at a time, into his brother's name, the same brother who came to Thanksgiving every year and asked me how the grandchildren were doing while knowing exactly what he was helping his brother do to me. Stage 3 was the petition itself. Rachel filed for divorce on my behalf in March, citing the standard grounds, but she paired it with something Gerald wasn't expecting: an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, freezing all business accounts, and prohibiting further asset transfers, supported by Walter's preliminary findings. "We're not asking permission anymore," Rachel told me the morning she filed. "We're telling the court what already happened, and we're making sure he can't do it again before trial." I remember sitting in her office that morning thinking about a girl of 20 who used to sit in strategy meetings at Bennett and Cross, taking notes, absorbing every word, never once imagining she'd need any of it for herself. The discovery that changed everything happened 3 weeks after the TRO was granted, and it happened, fittingly, in the same back office with the padlocked drawer. I'd gone to the Route 9 store to pick up a box of my late mother's china that had been stored there since we'd downsized her house years back. I still had a key, and Gerald, furious about the freeze on the accounts, hadn't yet thought to have the locks changed. I heard voices before I reached the office door, Gerald's and Frank's. "She's got nothing, Frank," Gerald was saying. "No job, no degree, no name on anything that matters. Kessler says the judge will laugh her out of the courtroom the second he sees her financials next to mine." "You sure about that?" Frank said. 40 years is 40 years, Gerald. Judges don't love that math. "She typed some checks," Gerald said. "That's not a business partner. That's a housewife with good handwriting." I stood in that hallway, my mother's china box still in my hands, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. Then I heard him say the part that mattered most. "Once this is done, Denise and I are looking at a place near Naples. New store down there, fresh start. Eleanor gets a check, and she disappears. That's fair. More than fair, considering a check. 40 years, and I was a line item he intended to settle and forget the same way you settle an old invoice from a supplier who no longer matters. I set the china box down on the hallway floor as quietly as I could, and I did not go in. I did not confront him. Confrontation was Kessler's whole strategy. Bait me into a scene, make me look unstable in front of a judge. I was not going to give him that. I walked back out to my car, sat behind the wheel in the Route 9 parking lot, and called Rachel from my cell phone before I even started the engine. Here is where I want to pause, because I know some of you listening have sat in a car exactly like that one, gripping a steering wheel, hearing your whole life discussed like a line item by someone who once promised to cherish it. If any part of this story has felt familiar to you so far, I'd love for you to stay with me for what comes next. Hit subscribe if you're not already, so you're here when I tell you the rest, and if you've got a hand free, a like helps more than you'd think. Now, back to that parking lot, because what I did in the days that followed is exactly why this story doesn't end with me disappearing quietly with a check. I told Rachel everything I'd heard, word for word, while it was still fresh enough to be precise. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she said, "Eleanor, I need you to write that down right now, verbatim, time-stamped, before you do anything else. And then I need you to come in tomorrow morning, because I think it's time for the countermove." The countermove had two parts, and Rachel executed them with the kind of calm efficiency that made me understand, finally, why Peggy had called her a shark with such affection. The first part was legal. Rachel amended our TRO filing to include the overheard conversation as supporting evidence of intent to conceal assets and relocate marital property out of state, which under Ohio law made Gerald's planned Naples purchase. A $290,000 condominium he and Denise had already put an offer on, according to records Walter Kim pulled within 48 hours, subject to immediate disclosure and freeze. Kessler, we would later learn, hadn't even known about the Naples offer. Gerald had kept that from his own lawyer, too. The second part was mine to do alone, and it was smaller, but it mattered to me more than anything Walter's spreadsheets ever could. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, had died 2 years earlier and left me $12,000. Not much, but hers and mine, and never touched by anything with Gerald's name on it. I had let it sit in an old joint savings account out of habit, the same habit of 46 years that had let everything else sit in accounts I didn't fully control. On a gray Wednesday in October, I drove to a different bank across town, one Gerald had never set foot in, and opened a checking account with only my name on it, Eleanor Doyle Whitfield. I moved that $12,000 in, and I sat in the parking lot afterward with the receipt in my hand, and I cried. Not from grief this time, but because it was the first account in 46 years that belonged to me and nobody else. And it felt like putting my hand flat against solid ground after a long time standing on something that shifted. The trial was set for a Thursday in late June in the Montgomery County Domestic Relations Court, and Rachel warned me the docket had assigned us to a visiting senior judge brought in to help clear a backlog. A man named David Morgan, semi-retired, sitting by special assignment 2 days a week. The name meant nothing to Rachel. It meant something to me, though I told myself it couldn't possibly be the same David Morgan, because what were the odds, after 48 years, in a county that wasn't even the one where Bennett and Cross had its offices? I said nothing to Rachel about it. I wasn't sure enough to say anything to anyone. I want to tell you who David Morgan was to me, because it explains everything that happened in that courtroom, and it is not the story people assume when they hear a woman say a judge's name like it means something. In 1978, David Morgan was 24 years old, working days as a file clerk at Bennett and Cross to pay his way through night classes at Cleveland State's law school, sleeping maybe 5 hours most nights. His wife had left him that spring, taking their infant daughter to live with her parents in Toledo, and David was drowning, missing filing deadlines, mixing up case numbers, showing up to work in the same shirt 2 days running because he'd been up all night with briefs and hadn't noticed. Harold Bennett, the senior partner, was 2 mistakes away from firing him. I was 20 years old, a legal secretary who noticed things, and I liked David. Not romantically, never that. He was practically a brother to me by the second year. And I could not stand by and watch a man that determined get thrown out for being exhausted rather than incompetent. So I helped him. I retyped a motion to suppress at 2 in the morning once, the week his daughter was born, because he'd fallen asleep at his desk before finishing it, and I found him there when I came in early. I loaned him $40 once for bar exam study materials, money I never asked back, and he never offered to return. Not because he was careless, but because neither of us thought of it as a loan. It was just what you did for someone drowning, if you had a hand free. And when Harold Bennett called me into his office in the spring of 1979 to ask, point blank, whether David Morgan was worth keeping on, I told him yes. I told him David had more discipline in one exhausted night than most of the junior partners had in a full week, and I told him a man ought to be judged by what he does when he's given a second chance, not by how badly he needed the first one. Harold kept him on. David passed the bar 2 years later. I left the firm in 1980 to marry Gerald, and David Morgan and I lost touch the way people do. not from any falling out, just the ordinary erosion of time and distance and a marriage that filled up every corner of my calendar. I heard, once, maybe 15 years ago, through an old Bennett and Cross colleague at a funeral, that David had become a judge. I remember feeling a small, warm pride about it, the kind you feel for a nephew's success. And then I went home and made dinner and didn't think about it again for 15 years. Until Thursday in June, when I walked into that courtroom in a navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion, sat down beside Rachel at the petitioner's table, and looked up at the bench, and there he was. Older, of course. Silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. 72 years old, the way I understood the math to be, but the same square jaw, the same way of tilting his head slightly when he was concentrating that I remembered from watching him hunch over depositions decades before. I felt my pulse pick up, but I said nothing. I was not going to be the one to make a scene out of a coincidence that might, after all, turn out to mean nothing at all in a room full of strangers. The trial opened the way these things do. Dry, procedural, Rachel laying out the financial disclosures, Walter Kim's report entered as evidence, the SBA loan document with my signature on line 14 projected onto a screen. Kessler, for his part, was smooth in the way expensive lawyers are smooth, arguing that my contributions, as he kept calling them in quotation marks I could practically hear, amounted to clerical assistance a husband might reasonably expect from a supportive spouse, not the kind of equity stake that would entitle me to half of a business Gerald had built with his own two hands. He used that phrase 3 times, his own two hands. I sat very still each time and thought about 40 years of reconciling a cash register that had never once, not once, balanced itself. It was during cross-examination, when Rachel pressed Gerald on the $410,000 transfer to Frank's LLC, that he lost the composure Kessler had clearly spent weeks coaching him to hold on to. His face went red, his voice rose, and he turned. Not to Rachel, but to the bench, as though appealing directly to Judge Morgan for rescue. "Your Honor," he said, "with respect, this is absurd. She's just a worthless old woman who never held a real job a day in her life. I built everything, every bit of it, and now she wants half because she signed some papers 30 years ago?" The courtroom went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something they cannot take back. Kessler, beside him, closed his eyes briefly, the way a man does when he watches his own case walk off a cliff. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, and I did not argue. I simply turned toward the bench, folded my hands the way I had folded them 1,000 times taking notes at Bennett and Cross, and I smiled. Not a performance, just the honest smile of someone finally, after 46 years, being permitted to say a true thing out loud. "Morgan," I said, quietly enough that the court reporter leaned forward to catch it. "Remember me?" Judge David Morgan froze, his gavel hovering an inch above the sound block, and for 3 full seconds nobody in that courtroom moved. Then he set the gavel down, slowly, and rose to his feet so fast his chair rolled back and hit the bookshelf behind the bench. "Oh my God," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of judicial formality. "Is that really her? Ellie? Ellie Doyle from Bennett and Cross?" I heard Kessler's pen stop moving beside Gerald. When I glanced over, his face had gone the color of the legal pad in front of him, because whatever confidence he'd built his whole cross-examination strategy on had just evaporated in front of him, replaced by the sudden, dawning understanding that the woman his client had just called worthless was a woman this judge clearly, immediately, and without a shred of doubt, held in the highest regard. Judge Morgan caught himself after a moment, sat back down, straightened his robe, and addressed the room with the careful precision of a man rebuilding his composure in real time. "Let the record show," he said, "that I am acquainted with the petitioner from prior professional association, more than 4 decades ago, unrelated to any party or matter currently before this court." He looked at Rachel, then at Kessler. "I want both counsel to understand I take my obligations of impartiality seriously, and I will address the appropriate procedural steps regarding disclosure and, if either party requests it, recusal at the appropriate time." Then he paused and looked directly at Gerald, and something in his voice hardened in a way I don't think Gerald expected from a man he'd just watched go weak in the knees over an old colleague. "But before we get to any of that, Mr. Whitfield, I want to say something for the record, as a private citizen rather than as the court, and then we will proceed properly." In 1979, this woman told a senior partner, I did not deserve to be fired for being human. I do not know what she has or has not been in your house for 46 years. But I can tell this courtroom from direct personal knowledge that worthless is not a word that has ever once applied to Eleanor Doyle, and I would be doing a disservice to my own conscience if I let that characterization sit in this record unchallenged, even for a moment. I will not pretend that moment wasn't the emotional peak of everything that had built toward it. 46 years, and a man I had helped as a girl of 20 stood up in a courtroom to say, essentially, that he had always known who I was, even when the man I'd married had stopped bothering to look. True to his word, Judge Morgan recessed the proceedings that afternoon, disclosed the relationship formally on the record, and, over Kessler's rather half-hearted objection, since by that point his own client's outburst had done more damage than any recusal question could, the case was reassigned to a different judge, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, to preside over the remainder of the trial without any question of bias hovering over it. I want you to understand that part clearly because I did not win this case, because David Morgan owed me a favor. I won it because Rachel Ostrowski and Walter Kim had already built an airtight case out of 40 years of receipts and a $410,000 paper trail. And because Gerald, given every opportunity to be reasonable, chose instead to call his wife a 46 years worthless in open court, on the record, in front of witnesses. Judge Morgan's recognition of me did not change the facts. It only made sure the facts got a fair hearing, and it made damn sure nobody in that room ever again mistook my silence for weakness. The reckoning, when it came, did not fall evenly across Gerald's family, and I think that's important to say, because I never wanted vengeance against everyone who'd ever stood near him. Only accountability from the people who'd actually done wrong. Frank cracked first. 2 weeks after the recess, under subpoena and facing his own potential exposure for facilitating an asset transfer, Frank sat down with Rachel and, through his own attorney, agreed to testify about the true purpose of Whitfield Bros, holdings in exchange for a release from personal liability. He couldn't look at me when he said it out loud in the deposition room that Gerald had asked him, back in April, to just hold some of this for a while till the divorce settles, and I'll transfer it back after. He mumbled an apology to me afterward in the hallway, something about how he never thought it would go this far, and I told him, honestly, that I appreciated him telling the truth, because it was the only decent thing left for him to do, and decent, at that point, was enough. My son Thomas took longer, and it hurt more, because Thomas had spent the early weeks of the divorce defending his father almost reflexively, the way sons sometimes do. Mom, you're being too hard on him. Marriages go through rough patches. As though 34 years old with 2 children of his own hadn't taught him yet that some rough patches are actually cliffs. What changed him wasn't the money. It was Denise. When the Naples condo purchase surfaced in Discovery, and Thomas understood that his father had been planning, quite literally, a second life with a woman 8 years older than Thomas himself, while his mother reconciled the store's books alone at the kitchen table, something in him finally broke loose from whatever loyalty had been holding him in place. He came to my house on a Sunday in July, sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have seen it. I think some part of me didn't want to." I told him there was nothing to forgive that mattered as much as him being here now, and I meant it. My daughter, Karen, for her part, had believed me from the very first phone call, no convincing needed, which told me something true about the different ways children learn to see their parents clearly. Gerald never broke, not the way Frank did, not the way even a small part of Thomas did. He held on to his anger through every mediation session, through the final settlement conference, through Walter Kim's full accounting laid out line by line. In the end, it didn't matter whether he broke or not, because the numbers had already done the work that his contrition never would have. Judge Alvarez approved a settlement that awarded me half the assessed value of Whitfield Hardware and Supply, including the recovered LLC transfer. $1.2 million, structured as a buyout over 18 months so the stores could keep operating without collapsing. Because whatever else was true, I had spent 40 years keeping that business alive, and I wasn't about to let my settlement be the thing that finally killed it. I kept the house on Larkspur Lane outright, paid off, worth roughly $340,000. I was awarded spousal support of $3,800 a month for 8 years. Given the length of the marriage and the disparity in earning capacity, the court found Gerald had deliberately engineered by keeping me off every deed and every payroll for 46 years. And separately, the court ordered reimbursement with statutory interest of the $45,000 I had wired to save the business in 2001. A total of $61,000 paid to me directly, the receipt I'd kept for 25 years finally doing the job I never imagined it would need to do. I moved through the months after the settlement with a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow Gerald always said he hated. I opened a small consulting practice, unlicensed but well-regarded, helping 2 other local business owners clean up their bookkeeping. Women, both of them, who'd heard through Peggy's ever-reliable network that Eleanor Whitfield knew how to read a ledger better than most accountants twice her salary. I had coffee with Rachel Ostrowski most Fridays, not as client and lawyer anymore, but as something closer to friends. And once, in September, I ran into Judge Morgan, David, at a diner outside the courthouse, both of us there alone, and we sat together for an hour talking about Harold Bennett, who'd passed years ago, and about his daughter, the one born the week I retyped his motion at 2 a.m, who was 48 now and a partner at a firm in Columbus. He told me, before we said goodbye, that he'd thought about me more over the years than I would probably believe, wondering what had become of the sharpest eye in that old building. I told him I'd wondered the same thing about myself for longer than I'd like to admit, and that it had taken me a very long time and one very ugly year to finally find out. I think about what Gerald said in that courtroom sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to clarity. He called me worthless because, for 46 years, he had never once had to reckon with what I was actually worth. Not to him, not on paper, not anywhere he'd bothered to look. That is the quiet danger in being underestimated. The people who do it rarely mean to cause harm. They simply never think to ask the question. I don't say any of this to you with bitterness. I say it because I want you to hear, clearly, that being underestimated for 46 years does not mean you have 46 years worth of nothing to show. Sometimes it means you have 46 years of proof, quietly filed away, waiting for the one moment someone finally asks you to produce it. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? Go on, tease me with it. The US, the UK, Australia, maybe somewhere I'd never guess, like Bermuda or even Antarctica? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, please. There is so much more waiting for you, with love and respect. Until next time.